Yes, ma'am. Okay, so we can begin by doing the homage to the Buddha, the salutation to the Buddha. 1, 2, 3. And then the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. And now we will be continuing with our reading of the Anguttara Nikaya, that's the numerical discourses of the Buddha, the book of fours. And now we come to sutta number 160. Quite an important sutta in some ways. And let me get my notes file opened. Okay, so this it seems to me that this sutta is actually composed by joining together what might be two separate discourses to form a composite sutta. And so first, the sutta begins by saying that while the fortunate one...
Excuse me, Bante, can you click on the continue? This meeting is being recorded. It's blocking the sutta. It says this meeting is being recorded.
That you have to click.
You just click the continue.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
For us, no.
Okay.
You
So,
click, then you will disappear.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, my screen is clear. Okay, so it begins, while the fortunate one or the fortunate one's discipline remains in the world, this is for the welfare of many people, for the happiness of many people, out of compassion for the world, for the good welfare and happiness of devas or deities and human beings. So this is the opening declaration. And now the next passages are going to expound or explain what is meant by, we use the English expression, fortunate one and the fortunate one's discipline. And let us get the Pali expressions used here, Pali terms. Okay, so the Pali word that's translated as Sugata is, that's translated as fortunate one, is Sugato. And the word Sugato is a compound of the prefix su, which gives the sense of good or well, and gata, which means gone. So literally, Sugata means well gone, which is not so clear. It doesn't really suggest very much in English. If somebody is well gone, what does it mean? So I rendered it a little bit freely as fortunate one. The way the commentaries explain this expression, they take the su on the one hand, what is good, to represent nibbana, the state of liberation, and gata is gone to or reached. So the Buddha is called Sugata in the sense that he is gone to the good, reached the good destination, which is nibbana. Another way that they explain this, they explain well gone, is that the Buddha has gone along the good path. That path is the Noble Eightfold Path. And so one who travels on that path is said to be well gone. And then another explanation depends on a little bit of a wordplay. Okay, we have this word gata, which means God, but if we change the T to a D, we have the word gada, which means speech. And so the commentary sometimes will say that the Buddha is called Sugata because he is one of good speech, whose speech is always truthful, beneficial, uplifting, conducive to the highest good. Okay, so it's hard to capture all of those nuances and meanings in any single English word, but I use the word fortunate one because there's another use of the word Sugata that we come across in the passage where the Buddha explains the divine eye, the working of the divine eye. And in that passage, he says that with the divine eye, one can distinguish those beings who are dukata and those beings who are sugata. And those who are dukata are those who have gone to misfortune, those who have been reborn in the lower realms, those who have, if reborn as human beings, are living in oppressive poverty, under a dictatorial government, who are subject to many injuries and illnesses. So those are dugata, which we could translate unfortunate, those who are living in misfortune. And then the opposite are those who are sugata. Those are the beings who have been reborn in good destinations, like the heavenly realms, the human realm. And as human beings are relatively affluent, successful in their undertakings, popular, and so forth. And so in that sense, we could take dugata to be unfortunate and sugata to be fortunate. And so from that context, we could transpose to this one and say that of all these sugata beings, the fortunate beings, the most fortunate is the Buddha, because he is the one who has reached the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. Okay, so this is Sugata, or the literal meaning of Sugata. And then in the sutta, the Buddha raises the question, who is the Sugata? Who is the fortunate one? And then he says here, and he's going to explain this by way of 10 epithets, 10 designations of the Buddha. So first he is the Tathagata. This is another word which is a compound involving the suffix gata. I think I've explained this before, but doesn't hurt to do it again. So Tathagata is a compound which can be broken down in two ways. One is as a compound of Tathagata, one who has come. Agata is the opposite of gata. Come, tata, in such a way. And then the commentaries give several explanations of tata, this prefix, how the Buddha has come. Or we could take Tathagata to be the compound of tata plus gata. So either way gives us Tathagata. So one who has come in such a way and one who has gone in such a way. But this expression is almost impossible to render in a meaningful and satisfactory way in English, so I just leave it untranslated. So, but whenever we see the word Tathagata, usually, not always, but usually it's used with reference to the Buddha. So here is the Tathagata arises in the world, and he's described as an arahat, one who has eradicated all of the defilements, one who is perfectly enlightened, who has attained the knowledge that penetrates the true nature of all dhammas, all phenomena, one who is accomplished in true knowledge, or I would say clear knowledge and excellent conduct. Then the word Sugata occurs in the definition itself. So the Sugata is a Sugata, the fortunate one, a knower of the world, the one who knows all the different realms of existence and understands all the different beings living in the different realms. And because he has that knowledge of all the different beings in all the different realms, he is the unsurpassed trainer of persons to be tamed. And the word that's translated as trainer is actually sarati, which is derived from the word rata, which means a chariot. And so one who is a sarati has a chariot, so that's the prefix sa, which means with, and rata is chariot. And then one who has that chariot is sarati, and then the A is lengthened, sarati. So he is literally it's one who has a chariot or a charioteer, and it's the responsibility of the chariot driver, I assume, to train the horses that are going to be pulling the chariot. And so the sarati then becomes a trainer. And the excellent charioteer is a trainer of horses, but the Buddha is the trainer of human beings, who tames human beings by prescribing the right methods of training. Then he is Satta Deva Manusanang. So Satta is the teacher, and he teaches, of course, we know he teaches people of many, many different walks of life. So he's the teacher of humans, but also he is the teacher of the devas, of the deities in the different heavenly realms. So particularly if you look at the Samyutta Nikaya, the first two chapters, the Devata Samyutta and the Devaputta Samyutta. In those two chapters, we see on many occasions deities in the dead of night, they come into the presence of the Buddha in order to ask him questions. So he's teacher of devas and human beings. He is, of course, the Buddha, that's the enlightened one, and he's Bhagava, which we translate a little inadequately as the blessed one. But we have to remember that the Buddha is not blessed by anyone, but I say that the Buddha is the source of blessings for the world. So he's endowed, the word Bhagava indicates one who possesses all excellent qualities. And so the Buddha possesses supreme purity, supreme wisdom, and the qualities of like boundless loving kindness, of great compassion, and great power, not omniscient power, but great power to teach and transform other people, other beings. And so through all of these excellent qualities, the Buddha is the Bhagava, the Blessed One. And thus he's the Sugata, the fortunate one. Okay, then comes the question, what is the fortunate one's discipline? And let me get the Pali expression here. Actually, I think I pasted it in. Yeah, so the Pali here is Sugata Vinayo. And the key word here is Vinayo, or in the stem form is Vinaya. And the word Vinaya comes, like many Pali words, Pali and Sanskrit words, it comes from a prefix and a base. So the base is Naya, which comes from the verb neti, or nayati, which means to, one of the meanings, to lead or to guide. And then it has the prefix vi, which suggests to lead or to guide away. So the Vinaya is that which leads one, guides one away, leads one away from misery, unhappiness, suffering, which leads one away from obsession by the defilements of the mind. And the word is used in at least two senses, maybe even three senses in the Pali text. One sense, the sense that's probably best known, is as the body of monastic discipline. So this is what is laid down in the collection of texts we call the Vinaya Pitaka, the collection of discipline. And that is a collection that contains the rules for the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, the monks and nuns. It gives the analysis of the rules, and it explains all of the variations on the rules. And it also includes sections that lay down the regulations for the Sangha as a whole, sort of the basic observances to be followed by the monastic order, such as the process of ordination, the occasions for reciting the code of discipline, the Patimokkha recital, the regulations for entering upon the Vasa, the rains retreat, for leaving the rains retreat, and many, many other minor rules of monastic observance, basic principles of etiquette and good conduct that are intended to instill faith and trust and confidence in the lay community. So all of that assembled together is what makes up the Vinaya in the first sense. And that is the narrower and more technical sense. The broader sense of Vinaya, I would say, is the entire training of the Buddha, the entire training in Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, in ethical conduct, meditative cultivation leading to Samadhi, and Panya, the development of insight, bringing wisdom, the penetration of the true nature of things. And the three of them, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, culminating in Vimukti, liberation. So that is Vinaya in the broad sense, which is sometimes equated with the entire brahmacharya, the entire spiritual life. Then a third sense of Vinaya, which is sort of related to the previous two senses, is putting away or removal. And so we find often that the Buddha explains, like, what is the escape from the five aggregates? Let me see if I can find an example of that quickly. Okay, so in this sutta, the Buddha is explaining the enjoyment, the danger, and the escape in relation to the five aggregates. And so he says, like, what is the escape from form, from material form? Then he gives the answer is that it is the Chanda Raga Vinayo. So this would be the putting away of desire and attachment in relation to form. And then the next is Chanda Raga Pahana, the abandoning of desire and attachment in relation to form. That is the escape or release from form. So here we have Vinaya is used as the removal, the putting away. Here is stated Chandaraga, desire and attachment. Other suttas will substitute other defilements. So Vinaya can be understood as the removal or putting away of the defilements. So those are the different senses of the word Vinaya, three senses. Okay, so let's see how this sutta defines the Sugata Vinaya, the discipline of the fortunate one. So it says that he, the fortunate one, teaches the Dhamma that's good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right meaning and phrasing. And remember these two expressions, because we're going to come across them later in the sutta. He reveals the perfectly complete and pure spiritual life. This is the fortunate one's discipline. Now, the way I understand this, we have two terms that are often joined together. The two terms are Dhamma and Vinaya. So the Buddha's teaching is sometimes said to be summed up or comprised as the Dhamma-Vinaya, in which we translate as the teaching and the discipline. And usually within conventional Theravada Buddhism is understood, okay, the Dhamma is the basket of the suttas, or sometimes more broadly, the Sutta Pitaka and the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which teach the Dhamma. And then the Vinaya is the Vinaya Pitaka, or the monastic discipline. But in this passage, I would understand that here we have also underlying this is that distinction of Dhamma and Vinaya, but the word Vinaya being used in the broader sense. So the Buddha teaches the Dhamma, so that is the doctrine or formulated teaching, which is good in the beginning, in the middle, and the end. Various ways to interpret beginning, middle, and end. Sometimes it's said the beginning is sila, or dana and sila, giving and ethical moral practice. The middle is the training of the mind, chitta bhavana, the development of the mind, or samadhi. And the end is panya and vimutti, wisdom and liberation. Okay, so this is the Dhamma, the teaching of sila, samadhi, and panya. And then we have the perfectly complete and pure spiritual life. So this would be the complete sasana, the complete teaching, as equated with the Noble Eightfold Path. So we might say actually that the Dhamma, when we have the compound Dhamma and Vinaya, Dhamma can be taken as the doctrinal teaching of the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, the three characteristics, impermanence, suffering, non-self, and various other doctrinal teachings. And then the Vinaya will be the complete course of practice, the actual training in Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, or the practice of the 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. So that is the fortunate one's discipline. And then summing up, he says, while the fortunate one or the fortunate one's discipline remains in the world, so even after the Buddha passes away, as long as the training, the discipline, the practice remains in the world. This is for the welfare and happiness of many people, out of compassion for the world, for the good welfare and happiness of devas and human beings. Okay, so the way I see it, this seems almost like a self-sufficient sutta in itself. Whoops. Almost as if we could almost as if this portion could be taken out and made a separate sutta. But then we have another portion, maybe we could see them joined as this is what leads to the preservation of the Dhamma in the world. And now in this portion, Buddha's going to explain 4 things that lead to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma. There we go. Okay, so these are 4 things that lead to the decline. That's the gradual deterioration over time. And then the disappearance. The disappearance is the vanishing of the Dhamma. So if you take the Pali terms here, yes, samosa is what I translate as decline, but it's from a root which means to forget. So it's a gradual forgetting of the correct Dhamma, the true and proper Dhamma. And then antaradana is the actual vanishing, disappearance, elimination of its presence in the world. Okay, so what are these 4 things? So the first is concerned with the learning of the Dhamma, the transmission of the Dhamma, and the learning of the Dhamma. So here the monks, and probably also we should add nuns, learn discourses that have been badly acquired with badly set down words and phrases. Yeah, I have, maybe I'll just take it from the, yeah, so first for badly learned, or badly acquired, which means badly learned, dukkhahitam, is from that prefix dur, which means bad or wrong. And gahita is literally it's grasp, but grasp in the sense of acquired. So they learn discourses that have been badly acquired, let's say badly preserved, with badly set down terms and phrases. So this indicates that the words and phrases of the sutta are extremely important, because this becomes the basis for understanding. So the Buddha, he teaches, you can see he teaches the Dhamma with the right meaning and right phrasing. So the phrasing has to be correct, has to be proper in order for the meaning to emerge, the right meaning to emerge. But the trouble sets in when the formulation of the discourse is not correct, when the words have been badly set down, words and phrases badly set down. And then what happens is when the words and phrases are badly set down, then the meaning is badly interpreted or wrongly interpreted. We could say a wrong meaning is drawn out from the words and phrases when they're wrongly preserved, wrongly transmitted. So this is the first thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the good Dharma. So we have words and phrases have to be precise, correct, and accurate. And when that is the case, then the right meaning can be drawn out. The meaning can be correctly interpreted. But if there's distortion in the words and phrases, then a wrong meaning is going to be drawn out. So this is concerned with the transmission of the teaching in the sense of the preservation of the textual basis for the Buddhist tradition. But now we come to some passages concerned. Please, everybody should be muting. Okay, thank you. Now we come to some passages concerned with the conduct of the custodians of the Dhamma, that is the bhikkhus, and I would assume bhikkhus should include bhikkhunis. So here the monks are said to be difficult to correct, and they have qualities that make them difficult to correct. They are impatient and do not accept instruction or guidance respectfully. Yeah, so this is sort of the basis of proper training in the monastic life. The word that's translated here, difficult to correct, yeah, the Pali word is dubacha, which again is from the prefix dur, plus the word vacha, which means word. So dur vacha is literally bad word or bad speech. And if you don't know the usage of Pali properly, you might think that this means, that the compound means that the monks are of bad speech. But that is not the meaning. That would be a case of grasping the meaning wrongly, interpreting the meaning wrongly. Dubacha means, here the word dur takes on the nuance of difficult, and vacha is still speech. So it means being difficult to speak to, in the sense of being difficult to correct. So in order for a monk, especially a young monk, to be able to improve and to develop in the Dhamma, that monk has to recognize their faults, their shortcomings, their misconduct, and be willing to correct and to change their conduct. And the way that takes place within the monastic order is that the monk's teacher and preceptor and other senior monks will be observing the younger monk. Sometimes it's not always a younger monk. Sometimes it's could be a middle-aged monk or an older monk. But in the typical situation, it's a younger, newly ordained monk. They will be observing him. And when they see that he has some faults and shortcomings, they will call those shortcomings to his attention, gently speak to him and criticize him and urge him to improve himself. And if the monk wants to train properly, they will accept that correction respectfully. They'll say, "Thank you, Venerable One. I appreciate that you point out my faults. This gives me the chance to improve myself." And then they'll make the effort to improve themselves. But it could be that the monk, if the monk is too butcha, difficult to correct, then when they're criticized or even gently and politely corrected, they'll become impatient and angry, and they'll say, "Who are you to point out my faults? You think you're perfect? People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. You better look at your own conduct, buddy. Don't talk to me like that." Or sometimes they might not speak back in rude and aggressive ways, but they'll bear resentment in their mind. They'll become angry. And sometimes they can persist in their misconduct and even exaggerate their misconduct spitefully, just to show that they're not willing to accept advice and correction from others. And so when that happens, when that becomes widespread in the Sangha, that leads to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma. Okay, now we come to the third factor that leads to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma. Okay, now we have a case where those monks, and again I would add bhikkhunis or nuns, who are learned, heirs to the heritage, those who have received the transmission of the teaching. And what's interesting is the Pali expression for this. And the Pali expression is agata agama. So agata is come to, and agama is literally what has come or what has come down. And it refers to the, we call this the body of scriptures. Though of course in the Buddhist day, there were not written scriptures, but it would be the orally transmitted teaching, the body or corpus, the collection of orally transmitted teaching. And so those who receive that orally transmitted teaching, who have learned the discourses extensively, are said to be agata agama. And as a result of this expression, the four collections of the Buddha's teachings, which we also call these the Nikayas, but they're also called the agamas, the four lines of transmission. And in the northern tradition, like in the Savastivada, Mula Savastivada, the word agama was consistently used for those collections. So they have the Dirgha Agama, the long collection, the Madhyama Agama, the middle size collection, the Sangyukta Agama, the collection or transmission of connected discourses. But in the Pali tradition, the word Nikaya has come to prevail over Agama. Okay, so, but these are the monks who are the heirs to the heritage, who have received the oral transmission. And then they're described as experts on the Dhamma, literally Dhamma-Dara, those who uphold, maintain, sustain the Dhamma. And the next is Vinaya-Dara, experts on the discipline, those who uphold, sustain, and in this case, it would be discipline in the narrowest sense, the monastic discipline. Then we have an unusual expression here, Matika-Dara. So Dara is one who upholds, who sustains. And then Matika is a kind of outline summary. And it's a question, what is meant by Matika here? The commentary to the Anguttara Nikaya explains that the Matika is the collection of rules, the rules of the monastic order for the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. The Vinaya is the entire body of disciplinary training, whereas just the bare rules themselves constitute the Matika, the outline or summary of the discipline. That's the explanation in the commentary. But some scholars have come to a different interpretation. They take the Matika to be the summaries of the teachings. So we have various lists of teachings, like the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 bases of spiritual power, the 5 faculties, the 5 powers, the 7 factors of enlightenment, the Noble Eightfold Path. So some scholars say that these summaries of the teaching, these kind of just lists of items, are what is meant by Matika. Yeah, so we just come to these. Yeah, please, somebody seems to be putting hearts on the screen. If you're doing that intentionally, please don't do that. Yeah, so there's different interpretations of what is meant by Matika, the outlines, and nobody is 100% certain what is meant by them. But the important point here is that those monks who are highly learned do not respectfully and carefully and thoroughly teach the discourses to others. And we have to remember that in the Buddha's time, and for about 400 years after the Buddha's passing, the teachings were not written down in the form of books, but they were learned by memory. They were transmitted orally to the next generation of specialists, and that generation would learn them by memorizing them. And so in order to ensure that the teaching is transmitted from generation to generation, would be necessary for the learned elders who have mastered the different bodies of teaching to teach the discourses to others. And it so happened that in order to ensure that this process of transmission would occur fairly successfully, the learned monks were divided up into different, call these committees, different groups with their own specialization. So there might be one group who would be the specialists in the Vinaya. These would be the Vinayadaras who memorize the Vinaya and all of the detailed explanations of the rules and regulations and then they have their group of disciples become Vinaya specialists. In the case of the Dhamma, or the doctrinal teaching, once the discourses were delegated into the 4 primary collections, then we would have specialists in the Digha Nikaya, specialists in the middle length discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya, specialists in the Samyutta Nikaya. So each of those groups would take an individual Nikaya and memorize it. And then they would have their disciples specialize in that Nikaya. And so those groups of specialists came to be called Bhanakas. I think it's that is reciters, because they would uphold the task of reciting a particular collection. So there would be, for example, the Digha Bhanakas, those would be the reciters of the Digha Nikaya. The Majjhima Bhanakas and so forth, reciters of the Majjhima Nikaya. Okay, so their task is to recite to their group of disciples, a collection of disciples, to teach the discourses that they have learned to their disciples. And the disciples learn them by memory, and they teach them to their disciples. And in that way, a continuous and unbroken line in the transmission is established. But what happens if the elders who have learned a particular text, particular suttas, don't teach them to their disciples? Then when they have passed away, those teachings are cut off at the root, and there's nobody to preserve them. The teachings are lost to later generations. And if that happens on a wider scale, then good Dhamma declines and disappears. Nowadays, of course, we have printed, the texts are preserved in printed books, but still, to ensure that they are understood correctly, it's necessary for the elders to take on students and then to teach them how to interpret and explain the discourses correctly. Okay, then the 4th factor that leads to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma is concerned with practice. So this is concerned with scripture. Number 3, concerned with scripture. Number 4, concerned with practice. So in this case, the elder monks and nuns become luxurious and lax, leaders in backsliding. Backsliding means that they slip away from the practice, that they live a kind of comfortable and luxurious life and don't dedicate themselves to the practice. So they discard the duty of solitude. Solitude doesn't mean that you have to become a complete recluse living all alone, but they don't go off into their own rooms or their own kutis, their huts, to dedicate themselves to the practice. But instead, they're fond of company. They like to sit around, maybe at the table in the dining hall, chit-chatting with their fellow monks, chit-chatting with the lay people who come to the temple, and they don't go off into solitude. Even, you could say, if there's a meditation hall, but if each one is sitting in his own seat practicing undertaking the practice. You could say that's even a kind of solitude. And then they don't arouse virya, energy, to attain the unattained, to achieve the unachieved, to realize the unrealized. So they don't put forth the effort to attain the deeper stages of samadhi, to arouse the different stages of insight knowledge, to attain the paths and the fruits, and to realize the ultimate goal, nibbana. And so when the elders become lax, luxurious, lazy, fond of company, of chit-chatting, then their disciples follow their example. They also become luxurious and lax, and so on. And this way, from generation to generation, even if the scriptures are preserved in books, but the practice disappears. And in this way, what takes place is the decline and disappearance of the good Dhamma. So those are the four things that lead to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma. And then there are four other things that lead to the continuation, the non-decline, non-disappearance of the Dhamma. I'll just go through these quickly because they're just the mirror opposites of the factors of decline. Here, the monks learn discourses that have been well transmitted with the correct words and phrases, and in this way they interpret them correctly. Second, the younger monks are easy to correct. They're patient. They accept the advice of their elders respectfully, and they follow their advice. The monks who are learned, the heirs of the heritage, teach the discourses to others, so those discourses can be preserved from generation to generation. And fourth, the elder monks are not luxurious and lax, but they give up backsliding and they resort to solitude. They arouse energy for attaining the unattained, for achieving the unachieved, for realizing the unrealized. And then those in the later generations follow their example. So those are the four things that lead to the continuity, non-decline, and non-disappearance of the good Dhamma. Okay, I think with that we can open up to some questions. Okay, Wesley.
Dear Bhante.
Okay.
So the question that I have is regarding the first factor for the decline of the Dhamma and first factor for non-decline of the Dhamma. Lately, I noticed, not lately, I guess, it's been probably a while at this point, a sort of movement to try to sort of recover the original words of the Buddha, I guess you can say, and trying to look at what could have possibly been modified and whatnot over time.
Yeah.
And I know that there's sort of those two camps, or one say that yes, this is completely necessary, and the other say that this sort of effort is kind of unnecessary, as it shows like sort of maybe like a lack of distrust towards the present lineages and whatnot, and the Dhamma that they have been received and whatnot. So I was wondering how exactly this first point, which sort of camp that would fall into, or exactly how this sort of modern day issue relates to this first point here.
Yeah, you're referring to this sort of effort to recover what is called or to study the early Buddhist texts and to do comparative studies between different versions of these texts. And I think this is an important undertaking because we have to remember that there were several different prominent early Buddhist schools. The only one that survived down to the present day in its that's remained intact is the school we now call the Theravada school of Buddhism, which preserves its text in Pali. But in northern India, or actually in India, after the early period of the unified Sangha, the monastic communities would settle in different geographical regions, and somehow the text, the transmission of the texts that were preserved in those different lines of transmission show some differences. And in most cases, the Indian originals of the texts from the other schools have been lost, except maybe for some fragments, but they've been preserved. One lineage went far to the northwest to the area called Gandhara, which now corresponds to eastern Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that school, called the Dharma-Guptaka, preserved its text in the language called Gandhari, the language of Gandhara. And another line of transmission, probably several lines of transmission, went across the Gobi Desert to China and then preserved in Chinese translations. Some texts came southwards and have been preserved in a Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. And so scholars have been studying, undertaking comparative studies of parallel versions of these texts. And what's interesting is that through these parallel versions, we note differences in the wording. And according to some objective criteria, one can't say that one version is consistently and necessarily better than the other versions. Like I've seen some comparative studies. My friend Venerable Analayo is the one who specializes in this, comparing the Pali and Chinese versions. And sometimes there'll be several versions preserved in Chinese from different lines of transmission, which are in agreement. And the Pali version can be different. And that seems to indicate that the version that was preserved in Chinese translation might be more archaic than the Pali version of the sutta. Whereas in other cases, say a Pali version and one Chinese version might correspond closely, but the other Chinese version would be somewhat different. In that case, that indicates that the version shared by the Pali and the Chinese school is likely to be more archaic than the version preserved by the other Chinese school. Yeah, so these, I would say, are quite important undertakings. And it indicates that there are differences in the words and phrases. But what was also emerging from these comparative studies is that when you take the different versions of the ancient suttas, though there are differences in words, phrases, arrangements, and so forth, basically the Dharma and practice that emerges from all those different versions is pretty much identical. There's similar explanations of the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, three characteristics. So here there's an interesting difference. In the version of the Sangyutta Agama preserved in Chinese, where the Pali and other versions always have just the three characteristics, the Chinese version has four characteristics. It has sunya, empty, as a fourth characteristic. So they have anicca, impermanent, dukkha, suffering, sunya, empty, applied to each of the aggregates, and anatmaya, non-self. Yeah, but generally, in the points of doctrine, the agreement is very, very substantially identical. Does that answer the question? And I would say that it's of great value, even a necessity from an academic point of view, to undertake these comparative studies of parallel versions.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah, and so what I say is that from these comparative studies, we could say that no school can claim to be the only one that has preserved the correct Dhamma. But it also shows that each school that preserves roughly identical parallel versions of these texts can all claim to have some version of the good Dhamma, of the correct Dhamma. Okay, I see some other questions. Let's see, I think there's Marcel is next.
Thank you, Bhante. Just now, Bhante mentioned that the Tathagata usually refers to the Buddha, but
Yeah.
there could be some other use. What
Yeah.
could there be?
The other use is in, there are these questions that were discussed by the different ascetic communities, the spiritual communities in the Buddha's time, about what happens to the Tathagata after death. Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does the Tathagata not exist after death? Both exist and not exist after death? Is it the case that he neither exists nor does not exist after death? So those were questions being discussed, not just amongst the Buddhists, but amongst the other sort of spiritual communities. So this indicates that the word Tathagata doesn't refer exclusively to the Buddha, because they wouldn't have been discussing what happens to the Buddha Gautama when he passes away. So from this, we could see that the word Tathagata was being used in a general sense to indicate the spiritually accomplished person, the one who has achieved the ultimate goal. Okay, so that I think is the answer to that question.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay, An Thong.
Thank you, Bante. I just wonder, Bante, when you explain to us about the Vinaya is the whole discipline or the whole training
Yeah.
of the Buddha. As a lay person, it's kind of impossible to receive that training. It's the only way is to ordain as a bhikkhu or
No. I said the Vinaya, the word Vinaya can be understood to refer to the entire training. So in this case, the word Vinaya doesn't mean the monastic discipline in the narrow sense, but rather the Vinaya, it covers the entire training of Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, of moral discipline, training of the mind, and wisdom. So a layperson who undertakes the precepts, trains in developing samadhi, and makes the effort to develop wisdom would be undertaking an appropriate vinaya for the layperson. And then there are many, many other principles of ethical training that the Buddha laid down for the layperson, which have sometimes been called the Gihi Vinaya, which would mean the Vinaya, the discipline of the layperson. And one finds that especially in the Digha Nikaya Sutta number 31, the discourse to the young man Sigalika. You find there the Buddha lays down many principles of training for a layperson. And so we could call that the Vinaya of the layperson.
Thank you so much, Bante.
Okay, so don't think you have to be ordained in order to get the Vinaya.
Thank you, Bante.
Okay, Bhante Buddhadatta in India.
Okay, salutation to you. Bhante, can you hear me?
I hear you clearly. Yeah.
Yes, Bhante. Thank you so much, Bhante, for your wonderful explanation on this sutta. I just wonder, Bhante, these 4 points regarding the decline of the Dhamma, does it also apply for the individual or also maybe to the place or any countries? For example, some places Dhamma flourishes and they preserve the Dhamma until now.
Yeah.
And some places it also declines. So it can be individual level or for the society or for the country at large.
Yeah, definitely. I would say like in a country, like one country, say that people can be following the 4 things that lead to the continuation of the Dhamma. But in another country, what would happen is that the things that lead to the decline and disappearance occur. And in that case, in that country, the Dhamma will decline and disappear. like maybe we could say back in, say, 10th, 11th century in India.
Yes, Bhante.
Okay, so the Dhamma by that time had been transmitted to Sri Lanka. Maybe it was flourishing in some other regions in Southeast Asia. But in India, the 4 factors that lead to decline and disappearance became prominent. And so the Dhamma declined and disappeared in India while it was preserved in Sri Lanka. I think at that time, well, it's probably in Southeast Asia. Okay, was that the point of the question?
Yes, Bhante. Yes, Bhante. And some of the countries, like the Middle East countries, in one point of time, there was very strong place of Buddhism. But now we see there is no Dhamma.
Yeah, certainly Afghanistan was a sort of stronghold. What is now Afghanistan? Perhaps
Yes.
even, yeah, I just don't know how far west it would have spread. But certainly there were strong Buddhist communities in Afghanistan. Okay.
Right,
Paul,
Bhante.
okay, Paul Wei.
Bhante, about the third cause for the Good Dhamma to decline and to disappear,
Yeah.
your translation has the word respectfully. So is it that they do teach the Dhamma but do not teach it respectfully, simply carelessly giving their own interpretations?
Yeah, the word the Pali word uses sakacha, which is a bit difficult to get a single word that a single English word that can translate this. Let me just find. I won't try to paste the word, but the word sakacha is from the verb sakaroti, which has the meaning to honor. So when you're teaching the Dhamma, one sort of honors it within one's heart, and yeah, but also it takes on the meaning of thoroughly or carefully. So carefully while honoring it within one's heart. So those would be the nuances of sakacha. Does that get the question?
No, so they do teach the Dhamma,
Yeah.
not right? So just the way they teach is not right. Is that the meaning?
I'd say probably it's meant that they don't, it's not actually clear. But maybe they don't teach at all, but maybe the word sakacha is used there just to show the proper way to teach. Yeah, I just don't know. But it seems that for the discourses to be cut off, that they're not teaching at all, or maybe not teaching thoroughly, just giving an outline of this discourse, but not explaining and elaborating on it. Yeah, I just don't know. Okay, Punika? Punika? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Maybe you're not muted. You have to unmute yourself. Okay, then we go for now to Vinyu.
Yeah, good morning, Bhante.
Good morning.
I have a question in regards to the Bhante. You have translated most of the Theravada preserved Nikayas, except probably the Digha Nikaya. And if you have a chance to go back 2,500 years and you meet the Buddha, what question will you ask the Buddha to preserve the Dhamma?
I don't know. I've never thought of that question.
Okay. Right, thank you.
I'd have to give some thought to the question.
Right, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I see Punika's hand since I called on her earlier. You want to try
Yeah, Bhante,
Okay, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, now I have your voice. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. Okay, I just can you elaborate on the Dhamma, the teaching of the Dhamma, good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, as it refers to Sila, Samadhi, and Panya?
Oh, if I'm to elaborate on that, then I have to explain it. All that's meant by Sila, all that's meant by
Oh,
Samadhi.
okay. Okay.
But I think if you have the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification,
yes,
in chapter 7,
okay.
where it deals with the recollection of the Dhamma,
Oh,
then it gives various interpretations of those phrases, good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end.
oh, okay.
But
Okay.
as is the case with the Visuddhimagga, it goes into too much,
Yeah.
we'll call it detail,
Yes.
too many versions. I think it's simple just to think Sila, Samadhi, Panya, but Sila, Samadhi, Panya, and Vimutti as the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, very
Okay.
good. Thank you.
Okay, Ali.
Thank you, Bhante, for your teaching. I'm wondering, when the Dhamma traveled to different parts of the world, to what degree did it acquire the taste of that particular culture? I mean, they may have interpreted it differently based on their own taste of that culture that, you know, they're raised in.
Yeah, that is true. But I think we have to distinguish between cultural adaptations and changes in the Dhamma itself. So certain like changes in culture would be quite appropriate, but we want to preserve the actual teaching, the doctrinal teaching and the practice. Not letting the culture sort of lead to significant changes in the formulation of the Dhamma.
Okay, because I know that some of the schools did change when they traveled, like to Japan, to Korea, and all of that later on, and adopted that culture more into it. But I was just wondering about the order. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, yeah, that is the case. But say, I mean, I don't like to like criticize other schools of Buddhism, but say, okay, in Japan, where now you have a predominantly married clergy instead of the celibate renunciant monastic order. To me, that's like a sign that the Dhamma intended by the Buddha has undergone a decline.
Okay.
That it's not what the Buddha intended, is to have, in place of a bhikkhu, bhikkhuni sangha, to have a priesthood of married priests serving in the role of the clergy.
Right.
Okay, Han Lin.
Thank you.
Han Lin.
Thank you, Bhante. I have a question related to these 4 points.
Yeah.
By reading through the 4 points, it looks like the Buddha anticipated, how the Dhamma is going to manifest, for generations to come.
Yeah.
So my question is there any sutra actually Buddha described how his teaching, is going to be transmitted, for many, many thousand years?
Not a sutta, but the commentaries give a description of how the Dhamma gradually disappears from the world. And it's based on the understanding that there are the 3 baskets of the teaching. So it says that the first thing to disappear, actually it explains the different stages of disappearance. So it said that in the first, I don't remember it so clearly, I think, but the first period, you have arhats who achieve the patisambhida knowledges. These are the analytical knowledges. Okay, the next stage, you don't have arhats achieving the patisambhida knowledges, but you have arhats achieving the 3 higher knowledges, the recollection of past lives, the knowledge of the workings of karma, as well as the knowledge of liberation. The next stage, you have arhats of lesser attainments, and so on and so on. I think I have a note on that, a long note in the numerical discourses of the Buddha. I don't have time to go into a detailed explanation of that process, but you could find it in the note in the numerical discourses if you have that. Okay, we have to come to the end, and there's just one more question, so I'll have to take Samantha.
Thank you, Bhante. I'll try and be quick. It's a bit similar to the previous question. I was just wondering if Buddha had this vision about the preservation of the Dhamma, why he didn't, or whether he did set any specific guidelines to keep the his Dhamma true to his words. And was it just, am I correct in saying, was it just 100 years after Buddha passed away that they relied on Venerable Ananda's memory to, to get the precise suttas, the teachings of the Buddha? And secondly, whether hopefully they were not lost in translation. And secondly, I heard that, once, if in the universe that is the or some way in the future, if the Dhamma declines, that a Buddha would appear, a future Buddha would appear or something. I don't know whether that's a story or whether that's...
Okay, there's three questions here, so let me take them. Let me take them briefly. Okay, first, whether the Buddha laid down any guidelines for preserving the Dhamma. In fact, he did. It's in some sutta in the Digha Nikaya. I think it's called the Pasadika Sutta, where he says that the monks should meet frequent. Actually, one finds also in the Digha Nikaya, and the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the great discourse on the passing away of the Buddha. But in the Pasadika Sutta, he says that the monks should meet often and then to recite the Dhamma together in order to ensure that the Dhamma doesn't get distorted. So they should recite and compare the teaching that they're reciting to ensure that it's correctly preserved. And in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, also there are a number of instructions from the Buddha to the monks on how to ensure that the Dhamma is preserved over time. So that's the first answer to the first question. Venerable Ananda was not, he was maybe a bit younger than the Buddha, but not living 100 years after the Buddha passed away, but rather according to the accounts preserved in the Vinaya Pitaka, this would have been the first rains retreat after the Buddha passed away. The Sangha met, 500 Arhats met, and Ananda was the specialist in the suttas, the discourses. So the monks relied on Ananda to recite the discourses that he had learned and committed to memory. Yeah, so Ananda is credited with being the one who preserved the discourses that became the Sutta Pitaka, and another monk, Upali, is credited with the one who specialized in the Vinaya and rehearsed the Vinaya at this first gathering, the first council. And then the third question, it's said that this is in the Digha Nikaya, Sutta number 26. As time goes on, the Dhamma disappears, human beings become more violent and vicious and corrupt until there's like complete chaos prevails in the world. But then gradually human beings recover their moral sense and their conduct improves. And then at some point in the future, then a Buddha named Maitreya or Maitreya will appear in the world and again teach the Dhamma. So this is a kind of cyclical conception of the, of the cosmic history of the Dhamma, that there'll be times when it's proclaimed by the Buddha, flourishes, and many achieve enlightenment through the practice of the Dhamma. Then it gradually declines, disappears, vanishes. And then after some time, then another Buddha appears in the world and again reestablishes the Dhamma.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bhante. And could we assume that the suttas we are reading now are true to Buddha's words?
I would say so.
Yeah.
Of course, there can be like little variations that we might find if we do like comparative studies of this with parallels in other transmissions. But this, I'd say, this could be quite we could have quite a high degree of trust in this sutta.
Lovely. Thank you, Bhante, for your teachings.
Okay, so let us then end. I'll just do a quick sharing of the merits. And again, I want to, as often we do, to direct our thoughts of metta, of loving kindness, towards the country of Myanmar, Burma, which is really becoming embroiled now in a lot of violence and chaos as the military junta clamps down on the population, arresting many people, killing people almost arbitrarily. And it's harming the well-being of the people and the country, which has been one of the main repositories of the Theravada Buddhism in the modern world. Okay, so let's share the merit with the Devas, Buddhas, and other beings. Akasa ta jabumata deva naga mahidika punyantam anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasa ta jabumata deva naga mahidika punyantam anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasa ta jabumata deva naga mahidika punyantam anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang dukkha pata chani dukkha baya pata chani baya soka pata chani soka antu sabepi panino. May those in suffering be free from suffering. May those in fear be free from fear. May those in sorrow be free from sorrow. May all living beings also be thus. We go sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante. Good health to you.
Thank you, Bhante. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhante.
Take care of yourself, Bhante. Be well.
Blessed day to everyone.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu.
Okay, okay. I'll be ending now.
Sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu.
Thank you.
Okay.